On behalf of ACG Los Angeles and ACG New York, good afternoon and welcome. Today, we will hear from Wendy Buxton, the president of LynnCo Supply Chain Solutions, an ACG Los Angeles and ACG New York member and sponsor. Wendy will be presenting on supply chain disruptions and post-COVID best practices. Supply chain hurdles that did not exist just 8 weeks ago now take a central role during discussions by CEOs, boards, and investors. So what are those traditional strategies that remain relevant, and what new best practices are emerging? We will spend the next hour hearing these insights and more from Wendy. During the webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the chat function. Toward the end of the session, Wendy will address as many questions as possible. If we cannot get to all of your questions during that hour, I will send those questions and your contact information to Wendy. We will get your question answered. All right, Wendy, let's get started.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, ACG LA and New York, for a great collaborative event on a topic that I know has been forefront in a lot of discussions. For the first time in my career, supply chain has been in the spotlight of every boardroom, every information medium. Everyone is talking about it. So I'm super excited to be here today to just elaborate on some of the emerging trends that we're seeing in the market. People are talking about it from both a demand and a supply chain perspective, and we're gaining rapid appreciation for just how supply and demand imbalance can bring chaos if your supply chains are not designed for agility and continuity. No one knows how this is going to play out. I certainly don't. No one has the magic 8-ball, but whether we're going to see a U-shaped recovery, a W, a L, or a Z, or something new that we've never seen before. It's been stated that only a third of the GDP is safe from a negative impact from the COVID pandemic, and that the GDP is expected to be down 25% in both Q2 and Q3 as 22 million Americans file for unemployment. But what we do know is that there is complete certainty around the future being uncertain. I came across this quote by an award-winning Japanese author and thought it was completely relevant. Once the storm is over, you won't remember how you made it through and how you managed to survive. You won't even be sure whether the storm was really over. But one thing is certain is that when you come out of the storm, you won't be the same person as you came in. And that's what this is all about. He talks about this in the form of people changing, but I attribute this equally to how companies around the world will undeniably be changed on a global scale coming out of this. Some companies are faring relatively well, while others are just completely bottoming out. It's very sad to see. But I just read yesterday that J. Crew, who was taken private in 2011 in a roughly $3 billion leveraged buyout, is now expected to be completely wiped out. Unfortunately, I don't think that this will be the only case of this. And this really precludes the fact that most of the private equity community that I've been talking to feel pretty strong that there will not be waves of financing to help struggling companies survive, or for even sourcing new deals if you didn't already have the raised capital for M&A activity coming into this. Investors that are hunkering down and that came into the pandemic with funds available find themselves in a unique position of investing in companies that were healthy prior to COVID, but just don't have the rainy day capital to withstand the decline market. Effectively, they have the opportunity to buy great companies for a great price if you have the available funds to do so. Capital infusion in existing portfolio companies is being heavily scrutinized. Investors are looking to ensure that they're putting their dollars where it's going to have the most impact. So evaluating the companies in their portfolio and the health and the wealth of those is extremely important. They're either going to be willing to infuse funding into organizations that have the ability to surge back coming out of pre-COVID, so they were good before and they really can be great coming out, or they were on their way to being great through prior investments prior to pre-COVID, and now they're going to be able to really accelerate and leapfrog in the market coming out of it, sort of that doom to boom scenario. In any case, scenario planning is taking the place of forecasting. Forecasting is typically derived off of historical trends, and I think we can certainly say that no one can use historical trends to predict the future in this case. The key is to have the ability to pivot quickly and ensure that you're conserving cash now as a priority. Supply chain is at the very core of the delivery of any scenario, regardless of what you're looking at, and a business's agility to boom coming out of our economy. Today, everyone is looking to conserve cash, but within a few short months, investors will be looking again to accelerate growth and to scale with agility coming out of this. and supply chain being the second to third largest expense in any organization. And certainly as buying patterns are changing and the world is changing, the supply chain has to be agile and be able to pivot quickly, coming out of this. Give me just a second. All right. So let's just start. Give me a second to figure out all the controls. So let's just think about a few and kind of level set on the market today. It's predicted that the economy is going to be slower to return to pre-COVID conditions and may never return in the same way. Certainly, buying behaviors have been impacted, and this is likely going to be a driving force in the new normal. One of the most common outcomes is the way in which this has impacted consumer behaviors on a global scale. So, we've seen people do panic buying. We've kind of leveled out on now people being working or buying just the essentials, and that creating the demand in the market today. Predictably, markets serving the pandemic are surging with more demand than can be supplied, as this graph shows. While pre-COVID markets are down right now, we are seeing that in any case, e-commerce or online buying experiences have improved by 28%. And those in the latter part of this graph that are showing a decline during this time will return back to their normal. But in most cases, or a lot of cases, as investors are looking at the health of their companies, they're really predicting that there's probably going to be a surge of bankruptcies coming out next, which is not an ideal scenario, but certainly is a great time right now while everyone is hunkered down to be looking at how can I be that company that surges out of this. So as we come out of this pandemic, the return of those industries will rebound. The extent of those, we're not sure, but what we do know is that new consumer behaviors have really generated out of this, and the business's agility to serve the shift innovatively and with differentiation is going to be key. It's my thesis and my prediction that e-commerce is at the forefront of this movement. So to illustrate, economic analysts are settling in on three factors that will drive a positive opening of the economy. First, businesses' supply chains have to be restored. The synchronization of supply and demand. Two, consumers have to be willing to dismiss their personal stay-at-home orders to return back to some level of normalcy. And third, the economy has to be able to adapt to what will evolve over time as the next new normal. This does not imply that the economy will rebound and rebalance itself like we've seen in the past. It's simply returning to its natural order. Instead, businesses are going to need to adjust to create it, and therefore consumers who are driving that new normal are creating these evolutionary shifts in the market will ensue, and it's going to cause the economy itself to adapt and survive. If you notice, supply chain is at the heart of nearly every discussion today, and certainly at the heart of all three of those points in driving the reopening of our economy. And at the core of the practices is what I would call scenario planning, using market signals rather than historical trends to really start to drive your business moving forward. Solving supply chain is a multidimensional puzzle, and it can be a tough box to unpack. And so today, we're really going to talk about ways in which you should be focusing your supply chain given its relative importance. Take your pick on any one of the transitional disruptors that are happening today at a macro level. The pandemic itself is resulting in not only businesses, but country level shutdowns, like turning off, water spigot, volatility of the oil industry, overwhelming the market with the supply of oil and demand. Political power struggles are fueled by emotion and aggression rather than reason and diplomacy. A lot of that's resulting in import and export tariff wars, among a lot of other noise in the economy. Any one of these has the power to turn the economy and the world supply chains upside down. Together, well, here we are. We're in this unprecedented time. My goal today is to share with you some perspectives on a few of the post-COVID emerging supply chain themes that seem to be taking hold in the global crisis. So let's talk a little bit about the paradigm shift to level set. Let's review the one theme that we see emerging vigorously and with ferocity. And because it's the best illustrator of why supply chain is so relevant, this is where I'm going to center most of my conversations today. As we all remember from our economic studies, consumption drives supply and demand, effectively the economy, and thus the world's supply chains. In essence, the way consumers purchase is undergoing a major paradigm shift. Panic buying has subsided. However, markets rebounding is still highly repressed due to just essential buying. As a result of this, though, and the imbalance of supply and demand within the supply chain, what we're seeing is that consumers are relaxing their expectations on on-time delivery. If you remember, prior to this, e-commerce was kind of limited to retail and consumer products, but really the stay-at-home orders required people to conduct business online. And Amazon kind of set the prime of 1 to 2 day delivery. But what we're finding now is that people are okay with, delivery within a week of order. But what they are demanding is a heightened expectation for more transparency into the supply chain. So we're going to talk today about the need and necessity to digitize your supply chain moving forward. E-commerce, as I mentioned, kind of hit its stride in retail and consumer product markets in 2012, and it was kind of the rite of entry into those markets. You just had to have it. Other industries have always been slow to adopt to this, kind of slowly over time. But the pandemic has literally created this overnight reliance on the adoption of online buying as an essential to business survival for all industries and markets globally. It's no longer a business to consumer equation that impacts retail and consumer markets, but it now impacts all types of businesses and their supply chains. Whether it's B2B or B2C expectations, they've all merged on one standard medium for conducting business: digital buying and delivery. And this has to be fueled by a very agile supply chain. It and other macroeconomic factors have generated a market demand shift that disrupts traditional supply chains that are most likely here to stay. So think about in the past, businesses, B2B type markets were used to bulk ordering. So inventory and stocking up was a general practice. You had min-max levels within the industry, but now when things are moving more toward unit orderings, one piece at a time, to create that agility and response to the market. Purchase orders used to be the way in which we drove, the economics of business, and that's now being replaced with digital shopping carts. So think about supply chains are now and will increasingly be required to flex with consumer demands literally on a day-by-day basis. So regardless of industry, product, geography, the new normal is predominantly going to be driven by consumer demand and delivery expectations on an order-by-order basis. So let's just level set on a few of those statistics. I just read through a survey because these are going to be relevant now to everyone. 53% of surveyed shoppers admit that their panic buying and stockpiling is over. It was, at the onset of the pandemic, but we're past that, so that's good. It allows us to create a little bit of a newer normal for our business. 87% of shoppers do and will continue to purchase through online experiences coming out of this. That was a much lower statistic before, and a lot of it was driven by generational gaps. And now we're seeing that regardless of generation, everyone has bought into this concept of digital procurement. 64% of those respondents said that free shipping was a predominant decision point in their shopping and their buying decision. And 94% stated the willingness to relax on-demand delivery expectations as long as there was transparency of expected delivery at the time of their checkout. So I bring these all to the forefront. Again, these were all discussions that used to happen only in very specific markets where it was a business to consumer type market. But we're really seeing and expecting that coming out of this, the presence of people doing business online is extremely important, and these will be universal requirements. And so, really, I wanted to kind of level set, on this. Amazon expected to thrive in these times as the predominant online buying platform in the U.S. While they did see a surge, it was not as high as they anticipated. In fact, I just read an article where they've actually seen a decline in market share, handicapping their Q1 earnings per share. So they captured about 44 to 45% of the online buying market coming into the pandemic, and this has dropped by over 12 points since then. And a lot of people, that's really astonishing because at the onset of this, we were expecting that Amazon was just going to really boom, and certainly they haven't suffered through this, but they certainly haven't generated the type of accelerated growth and the acceleration in their earnings per share that was anticipated. It's my belief that the rise of e-commerce availability is at the forefront of this movement. So more and more companies, in order to thrive or at least continue to survive, through this, had to create a digital presence. So whether they were a small local business, an emerging mid-market company, or even a national conglomerate that's going global, almost all have now launched digital consumer experiences. Given their marketplaces more choices, more diversity, and freedom to exercise brand allegiance without intermediaries like Amazon. I know that, just the other day I went to go buy something on Amazon, and I do price compare. What I recognized was, in buying this product on Amazon, while I was able to get 1 to 2 day shipping, I was going to have to pay $10 more, or in this case 20% more, to buy it on Amazon. And I was actually able to, for the first time, go directly to the market the brand that I wanted to buy from, and they had a digital experience. So I was able to get it for 20% less, and they were able to meet relatively, shipping and delivery expectations. While it was a little longer than Amazon, it was still acceptable to me. So intended or unintended, all of these businesses, in doing this, have reinvented their sales strategy. Now, again, whether they recognize what that meant to them or not is still yet to be forecasted. But their eyes are quickly being opened to the fact that their brand and their product are now available in the market on a global scale, and with service demands that they may not be designed to meet. So reinventing those sales strategies is a lot about saying, fish where the fish are was kind of the traditional. Well, now then you're fishing in the ocean, and your ability to sell everywhere your customers are without added expensive brick and mortar costs is an additive advantage if you're ready for it. Another thing to consider is the digital imperative. Optionality is the new optimality. It's not enough to have a digital purchasing experience anymore. Everyone has that. So how are you going to differentiate yourself? And there was a lot of companies that really kind of started this moving into the pandemic, but I think it's going to really take hold, coming out of it. And that's having the ability to personalize the shopping experience. And that, I think will quickly become an essential rather than a differentiator. Just think about it. Think about Wayfair. You have the ability to, take a picture of your room, pick out the furniture, and you can actually see your furniture, in the new furniture in your room prior to purchasing the product. If you think about this more from a B2B market, I was just talking to a friend of mine who owns a filtering manufacturing firm for the oil and gas industry. And they had to launch the online 3D rendering to scale of one of their products so that people could see it fitted to the exact specifications at the oil drill site. Those are all things that are now, people are expecting to experience with this digital boom. And finally, not long ago, order today in any market and receive within a week to several weeks was the norm, particularly in automotive, industrials, all of the manufacturing environments. But even those environments now have buyers that expect to see their products inside of a week. So, we've been seeing these pressures in the supply chain, but I think we're just going to see that supply chains actually implode as a result of these demands coming out of pre-COVID. They've always taxed the elasticity of any well-performing supply chain. So imagine what it's going to do to any ill-prepared supply chain. Just think about a local company who is used to foot traffic sales, and now being faced with servicing orders raining in from all over the United States. They'll have limited ability to scale sourcing, fulfillment, shipping to meet that new demand because they just simply haven't been faced with that problem before. A company that produces shell screens for oil rigs in the Gulf, they were pleasantly surprised and realized that there's a high demand for those products in Dubai. When they opened themselves up digitally, orders began to flow in. And they really have no understanding of imports, exports, duties, taxes, just the sheer complexity of orchestrating such a shipment at a reasonable cost. So, the hurdles exist on every single order. And then if you multiply that by the acceleration of orders, the growth of the companies coming out of this, with compressed time to market expectations, it can really create a difficult situation where instead of gaining market share, these companies can actually, lose market share if not well prepared from a supply chain perspective. And I know it all sounds tedious, it sounds complex, and as the owner of my company, Mr. Fritz, would say, kind of says it sounds gunky. Supply chain is a difficult, concept because it's multifaceted. It's the underpinning of an entire business. But its agility and effectiveness makes the difference between achieving desired profitability and a failed investment all on its own. I actually met this morning with about 45 financial advisors and CFOs in the market, and I think they were really kind of astounded by the fact that supply chain can really have such a strong impact on the financial relevance of a company. So let me just kind of walk you through a particular model. In this case, here's $100 million company. And this is a real case that we've looked at before and helped a private equity group, do a valuation assessment on prior to buying the company. And what they really wanted to know and understand is, how healthy is the supply chain, and will I be required to, put capital into it to make it agile enough to grow with my investment strategy. So it's a $100 million company. Coming into it, it had an operating loss of $8 million. And as you can see in this particular example, when we looked at some of the key underpinnings of the supply chain, the health of the supply chain, we were able to quantify, the wealth that was available to mine very quickly out of this supply chain. And in this case, it actually freed up working capital to the tune of about $13 million on a $100 million company. I mean, that's huge. And that investor was able to self-fund then a good portion of their investment strategy without having to take external financing. So when you think about this, a lot of people, they assess these one time and in a snapshot. But what we're seeing and we have to think about is with e-commerce, given that literally overnight you could go from being a regional market provider to a global market provider, you have to constantly be reassessing with regular frequency, these key components in the supply chain that can really tie up cash and drive profits. In this particular case, just by addressing the supply chain and freeing up $13.5 million of capital, we were able to take it, the supply chain was able to take it from a loss position to the desired profitability position prior to even accelerating the growth. And we certainly provided, the ability to set that up for scale. So there's real relevance here. And yeah, it's extremely important. Aside from your marketing and your people strategy, supply chain strategy is easily one of the top 3 levers to assess and focus on with purposeful intent and a dogged rigor. Market-changing variables challenging profitability of companies today have been historically managed in the supply chain by relentlessly forcing, pushing, demanding more from every partner and link up and down the supply chain. So if you think about it, B2B markets, competitive pricing has traditionally been beat down through edict with their suppliers, pushing the cost of inefficiencies further up and down the supply chain. Everyone bears the burden. In a B2C market, product price competitiveness and free shipping has always reigned. However, convenience and personalization of that experience have potential to command a premium price. How many of you were willing to pay more, a little bit more, because you were able to get that personalized, experience? Think about, shopping at Whole Foods rather than Walmart, or even better, how about buying the same product on Amazon at a higher price than you could buy direct simply because it was just easier? Those concepts are now transcending every industry and every consumer market. We're retraining consumer expectations, or the pandemic is. It's retraining us to expect everything, expect a competitive price, get free shipping, one-click buying, delivery in just 1 or a handful of days, and all while investors like you are trying to continue to demand rising profits within the companies. So, simply, supply chains that are not agile or resilient enough to withstand the surrounding pressures of tomorrow's demands, and literally this could be the tomorrow demand, they're just not prepared also from a continuity perspective in the face of economic inevitabilities. So, when we look at this, there's a few points that we've been gleaming out of the market and talking to our private equity customers, the executives within the portfolio companies, and ways in which we've also been helping our customers. And, I just want to share some of those with you. Again, these are these are, some key points. They're not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form. But we do think that aligning, evaluating, aligning, operationalizing the supply chain for the new normal is going to have one or many of these particular factors. So supply chain, so the relevance of all of this, we just saw the financial impact, but what e-commerce is really doing is having a dramatic impact on how distribution networks are being run in the future. It's going to be more and more important for products to be placed in the supply chain to meet the speed imperative. It's very difficult to have a national DC or only one DC on the West Coast servicing everybody in the United States, Canada, and North America in a 1 day or 2 day, order to delivery experience. And so, it's really going to be important that you're able to understand, where your markets are and be able to create little micro, pockets of product so that you can meter those out to your customers. I think it's going to be extremely important to diversify your sourcing strategies. I don't think that's some big revelation. I think it's something that's been, that people have really talked about. The fact that, China's shut down, which is where the majority of a lot of our consumer products, came from. It really left a lot of people kind of saying, where else do I go for this? And having to, really run at a quick pace to try to find other sourcing alternatives and establish relationships with them. So whether, and if you also then think about that, it's not only your sourcing strategies of where your product and your raw materials are coming from, but you also have to look at your transport strategies. How am I going to get that product? How am I going to pivot from one source to the next in different countries, whether it's local or it's in Mexico, more of a nearshoring scenario, or if I'm taking a completely different global approach. You also have to have logistics networks set up to be able to handle those and pivot quickly. We talked a little bit about digital transparency of order delivery experience, being an imperative in the future. But what that really means is that as consumers are online and expecting that experience, you also have to open up your supply chain to digitization, which means you've got to have, complete visibility, control and understanding of where things are in your supply chain. And you have to be willing to open your book and share that with the consumer base. That will be part of the new normal expectation. And so, whether you're a manufacturer, a distributor of automotive parts, or direct consumer products, having the online experience is going to be an imperative. Supply chain sources to manufacture or distribute product now on a global scale must be reinspected to ensure that you can meet the speed to market demand. Demand fulfillment in the future will be heavily dependent on seamless supply chain experience. So, as we saw in the earlier statistics, digital innovation and speed are going to be essential. It's important that you understand your distribution network, where product needs to be placed as a first imperative. And then now that you're opening up your business to the world, predicting and forecasting where orders will originate and to what magnitude could literally, have you looking at, the markets could be non-existent. It could be a trickle of orders, or it could literally become an avalanche of orders. And you have to ask yourself, is my supply chain resilient enough to pivot depending on any one of these scenarios? If you consider the e-commerce shift means distributing faster to your marketplace, it kind of begs the larger question that I know if I didn't address it now, it will come up in questions at the end of this, but it's really on a lot of people's minds today. It's like, should we consider bringing all of our sourcing back to the States? What are people doing about Mexico and the different corridors, there? What about Canada? Is that an opportunity? Should I be sourcing domestically versus globally, nearshoring or offshoring? And, my answer to that is, really one that has always been, you have to look at your total landed cost in making that decision. A lot of times people look at just product price. So while China or some other offshore market may offer those products at a lower cost, you also then have to factor in, what is my cost to stand up a quality assurance program that ensures that my defects and my throwaways that coming into the States after being 30 or 45 days on the water, that those are minimized. As I'm sure many of you sourcing globally have found, is that, quality assurance programs overseas and in Mexico are not as rigid to be able to meet the expectations of American consumers. So you have to look at what your cost is to stand up a better or an augmented quality assurance program, and you have to be ready to deal with the cost of defective and throwaway products. When you add all of those together and look at your total landed cost, it may not be as attractive to source in other countries as it would be locally. Some people are doing it out of necessity, though. The U.S. doesn't manufacture as much product as it did before, so you have to globally source for that. I guess my point on this is, it's not an either or decision anymore. As you look at opening yourselves up to the market, you have to be able to solve for global nearshoring and domestic sourcing options in order to really fulfill the future demand landscape. And I really think that the key to diversifying your sourcing and logistics strategy really has to take impact on both the supply and the transport side of your product and your finished goods. Much like technology, we all expect to have high uptime with business continuity, and people invest large amounts of money in ensuring that systems, provide that level of service, to their user base. Supply chains have to be considered the same way. You have to have business continuity. What will happen if China shuts down? What do I do if all of a sudden Dubai starts ordering, from here? And what happens if the shipping lines, shut down, or they reduce their sailings like they are today? So maybe I don't have as many options available to me. The fact of the matter is, you have to create business continuity for your supply chain, just like you would for anything else. And the way that you do that is to scenario plan, draw out scenarios, and then put together, in this scenario, here's how my supply chain, here are the triggers and levers that need to be pulled on the supply chain. Equally important to your customers' buying experience is their delivery experience. This is where you have the most opportunity in the future, I think, to be inventive and differentiate yourself in the marketplace. The new normal around delivery expectations are really going to be around prominently displaying expected delivery date and time frame at the time of order. I know I recently, just ordered something online, and while it came up and said, look, this has a 2-week lead time, I was okay with that because they told me that ahead of time, so I knew what to expect. I've had other experiences where they didn't, and my expectation was it would just show up in a few days. So I found myself having to call them and ask them, where is it? And then I found myself disappointed when they said it will be 2 weeks. So it's just a difference in making that visible. But it also means that you have to understand what your logistics capabilities are ahead of the actual ordering cycle. And more importantly too, consumer order tracking. So talk about that transparency, them really being able to see into your supply chain and know where their order is becoming extremely and aggressively innovative. So think about Uber tracking. When you order an Uber, and you can literally see where the car is, how many minutes away it will be, what your driver's name is. That's the type of tracking for any type of order, wherever it is in the world, that consumers are now going to be expecting in the future. And so the more consumer transparency, the more tolerant of the longer lead times they will be in the future. So while these concepts have been around for years, they've been considered, kind of progressive differentiators. Today and into the near future, they're rapidly becoming essentials for any business and any industry to simply exist, much less to survive. So you kind of have to ask yourself, how prepared are each one of my portfolio companies in delivering, this type of an experience to my customer? And is my supply chain, which is really your big risk point, is it designed to be able to pivot and change as needed based on external influences? Let me just give you a couple of illustrative examples that compare and contrast on how these types of shifts can impact supply chains. So this is an example, if you think about, the e-commerce and the shift in your distribution networks. Traditional supply chains supported by brick and mortar are often left unoptimized, but they're effective enough, at least in the past, for where consumer demand was surging and market pricing could be made up in lack of surgical precision. Ultimately, holding inventory at every node in the supply chain ensures the timeliness to market, and it makes up for any supplier disruptions. However, it does that at a high cost, as you saw in the financial example I talked about earlier. Or in the bigger corps, the solve has been to require their major suppliers to reside inside business complexes of their customers. For instance, automotive, as they opened up in Mexico, they started to pull their major suppliers into close proximity, and this was their way of eliminating disruption and conserving cost. And while this worked really well for them, it really handicapped their suppliers' ability to diversify their risk and command their own growth in the market. In my time serving in the industry, what you see on this picture is kind of the norm. People, it's difficult to forecast. Data is hard to come by and hard to come by with precision. And so, we find that the supply chain just kind of traverses itself, all over the place. In this case, it looks like a ball of yarn. And that's okay. But what this really, meant, this was a profitable company. But what this meant to me, just visually, is that there is an incredible amount of opportunity to really synthesize the consumption with the supply of their product with their market demand.
Hey, Wendy,
Yeah.
This is Michael Rivera. I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're not seeing the presentation, and I'm hesitant to put it up because I'm not sure what slide you want to be on or where we want to advance it. So there we go.
Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Sorry, so everyone should probably see this, or should be able to see that now. So, here you can see that product is moving all over the globe with little precision, and there's a hope of meeting, delivery expectations. And I don't know about you, but in my time of business, I've learned that hope is not a good strategy, and certainly not a good supply chain strategy. Let's look at something in contrast, though. A well-designed e-commerce distribution footprint looks much more palatable. It's synthesized with the market demand. It makes sense, right? There's a good point-to-point logic and reasonableness about it. This one is really calibrated for an e-commerce supply chain where supply and demand is synthesized. It's getting the right product into the right market regions at the right time. You don't have to elevate your inventory, to do this. You just have to be able to understand, what market you're serving. You've likely heard of or even practiced lean and just-in-time, type strategies, and any company that is already leaning heavily on these are really fertile ground for the emergence of an agile e-commerce supply chain. So how much product is and what product is metered into each consumption region is typically derived again by the scenario plans rather than forecasts. Those scenarios can be things like, what if I receive orders from another country? How will I handle that? What if my primary supplier is unable to meet replenishment demand? How will I react to that? And how does that change and make me pivot in relation to this distribution footprint? So the more market density, what we're also finding is the more that you should consider, kind of what I call closet storage and final mile solutions as a function of your supply chain. So closet storage would be like, metering smaller amounts of inventory straight up into your consumption markets. As in contrast to using large national or regional distribution centers that also then require you to have long haul logistics, to get to your customers. And so that's a good example of a compare and contrast of is as you go through designing, evaluating and designing your supply chain and looking at its agility, just visually, it should make more sense and it should be more micro focused to the consumer market that you're in. And so, if you think about as well, not only, where you're going to place your inventory, but how are you going to get it there? When it comes to product transport, you have to prepare, as I mentioned earlier, for global transport, offshoring, nearshoring, and domestic transport, all of those methods. And you have to look at and be able to kind of pivot depending on what the transportation industry market is doing at that time. For instance, the economic downturn right now will have favorable effects on the capacity and pricing within our domestic market, probably for a while to come. In this top graphic, you see that the number of loads per truck per week in the domestic market has been cut in half. You couple that with plummeting fuel prices, and you have an opportune time to assess, your long-term contract or blanket pricing agreements that you have in effect with your carriers, to your benefit right now. Housing, construction, industrial, manufacturing account for more than 60% of the trucking volumes in today's domestic market. And it's going to be really hard for those carriers to maintain pricing power as volumes continue at a sustainable decline level. So now is a good time for you to go to your partners and try to build those strong relationships, but also work with them to move your pricing with the fluctuations of the market. The one wild card here is that the average age of all the drivers and their vulnerability to contract the COVID virus, could really leave capacity exposed for many months to come. So that would be kind of the balancing factor that we have to continue to watch. From an international, if you think about, the fact that you have to source globally or you have a global consumer marketplace, we've experienced sharp decreases of 30% or more in most major ports. I just looked at a report this morning that they're expecting both the East and the West Coast ports to continue to be at a 20% decline over the next 3 to 4 months. I'm not really expecting any type of return in capacity and volume levels for another, until the latter part of this year. And as a result, what they're doing is rather than holding their operating costs associated with all of those ships being around, is that they're just reducing their sailing schedules. So that's really allowed them to kind of align their supply and demand with price points so that their price has been relatively stable in the market. But what it's done to your portfolio companies who need to use that as a method of transport, it's really, caused them to have to plan much further ahead to ensure that they are securing capacity on what available ships there are. One of the alternative things that we've seen, which was more of a reactionary statement, it's calmed down some. But when containers and the ocean lines were not moving, and China was shut down, so the supply base was even limited. People were really transitioning over to air shipments, and air shipments are typically reserved for expedited type shipping and transport at almost any cost. We saw air shipments over the last 3 months. The volume in that has rose over 160%. The supply of essential products such as medical supplies, has allowed this market to command and continue to command premium plus rates. The airline industries in the state that they're in, they started retrofitting their passenger planes to become cargo planes and carry some of that cargo. But it's anticipated that it's just not going to be enough to really move the needle for the next couple of quarters. So those are all things that you have to really be, considering, as you look at your scenario planning. And with so many options and economic influences happening, you just have to ask yourself, how do you make agile decisions that meet your customer and your investment expectations? As we saw at the beginning, e-commerce demands order to delivery inside of a week, and in some cases as little as a few hours. To accelerate the speed to market with free shipping without dipping into the profitability margins becomes very difficult. Supply chain replenishment absolutely has to be synchronized with the demand patterns of your marketplace. So, an offset of this would be, I've heard, some people say, well, I'm going to go ahead and get inventory. I'm going to buy as much product as I can while it's available, and to really just kind of sit on that inventory and make it available because people wish they had it coming into some of this. And while that's a good reactive, situation, what they're going to find is that their inventory costs are going to outweigh the benefit of that. There are other methods to be considering. You can provide a small buffer of inventory in each of your regions of consumption that give you the opportunity to employ longer lead time and less speedy type methods that are also less costly, but still yet deliver that expectation to the customer base. A good example of that, we had a customer just the other day that is used to, we'll just use a domestic example. They're used to, trucking, across country to meet the demand of their consumers. And as they really kind of accelerated out of this pandemic, because they were providing some of those essential supplies, what we found is that they could, if with proper planning and really just sitting down and strategizing about it, they could actually leverage rail for a large portion of that haul, and then just use trucks to provide that final mile delivery. And while it added 2 to 3 days to their supply chain, they were able to offset that with a little bit of inventory buffer, and the net effect was a double-digit cost reduction. So those are all methods, and there's many more that you just need to sit down and strategize over. And so I think finally coming into this, I think the last thing that we really want to focus in on is the fact that best practices at any level, whether it's the supply chain operations, cash management, whatever it is, what were best practices or considered best practices that everybody thrived for before the pandemic are now going to become essentials, just to survive and exist as a business. And the way in which we're really going to accelerate and grow coming out of this is to really look at what the new normal is going to be around the supply chain. So if you think about the ante for operational excellence and innovation has just been raised. Supply chain touches every aspect of the company, and best practices throughout the business are rapidly transforming from progressively being elective to essentials, and to entering into and thriving in any market. So just to expound upon that, this is a chart that I found really helpful from an article that I read the other day. I thought it was a great visual to really kind of show a before, a pre-COVID, and after. What that new normal needs to look like. And you really can use this as a gauge in looking at your portfolio's companies at the health and wealth of their supply chain to kind of see where they are in this progressive maturity of their supply chain and how ready are they to be able to meet the new normal in the future. So the first level is one a lot of you step into, where companies are just working hard to maximize individual functions. So enterprise effectiveness is not as much of the focus as it is that just each individual function in the business is operating well. Level 2 is basically saying, look, I recognize that I need to link across my functions. So I need to blur the boundaries and begin to journey into this concept of continuous improvement. And that's typically in the form of just open up the lines of communication. But this was really the starting point for gaining insight into the supply chain. So if you're at this level, you're on the starting line of your journey of getting to the point where you can service the new normal in the future. The third level of this is companies that have achieved visibility of information across the organization. So it's not just about communication, but really the sharing of information to help minimize supply chain surprises by helping to understand those supply chain processes as they traverse across the functions in the organization. And so those were really kind of where the precipice has been, and everybody's thought process in the past, and even just getting to the visibility level in a lot of organizations and industries has been very difficult, and not everyone has achieved it. But certainly, this is no longer the final state to achieve to be, but really just kind of the starting point where you need to be. If you look at the last 3 components of this. A lot of companies are starting to really, look at collaboration, where supply chain can help determine how best to meet the needs of the marketplace. The supply chain that works as a whole to enhance the customer experience and minimize inventory. So that's this whole collaboration between all of the linking partners within the supply chain source. Not only are we just communicating, we have visibility, but now we're collaborating on best practices and ways in which to improve as a collective. The 5th level is synthesis, and this is really, where we are trying to harness the energy of change to help address turbulent marketplaces and ensure customer satisfaction in kind of a moving environment. It's creating a unified supply chain at a global level. At a first point and this is really like the first point where supply chain can be agile and pivot with market demand. And then finally, when you get to the end of this is where you really have the ability to say we have a good, solid, agile, mature supply chain that can pivot and can really, at this point, I can feed it with velocity. I can accelerate growth and continue to meet that speed imperative for shorter time frames to delivery that kind of begets the demand of the consumer market. So just to summarize, we talked about kind of 4 supply chain levers that are impacted by consumer behavioral shifts, which we think is going to drive whatever the new normal is. You really have to look at distribution fulfillment and the footprint of your distribution as it shifts, what that shift needs to look like as you open up your markets. You then have to look at, how do I optimize inventory at a placement at a micro level within that distribution footprint? How do I make sure that I'm replenishing at the most economical rate? You have to look at logistics agility as the third point. Just how am I going to get product from point A to point B in any one of these scenarios, and what are my alternatives if the market demands that I have to shift and pivot? And then finally, innovating around the digital imperative that's coming out of this is going to be, key, I think, to differentiation. But the digital imperative is not just about the consumer's buying experience, but it's also about digitizing the supply chain so that it can be agile and transparent to the market. And so, just in summary, when you're developing your strategy, companies have to think beyond traditional digital and physical supply chains and evaluate all your options. We talked about scenario planning and business continuity planning being a core piece of this. That can include anything from mobile, desktop, social media, retail, e-commerce, marketplaces, brick and mortar, and more. And probably not any one of those, but a combination of those strategies. It's becoming increasingly important to maintain a single unified supply chain, and complexity, comes into play here. The financial incentives, as I've proven, is well worth investing in an agile supply chain. So if you can focus on aligning your supply chain with shifting consumer behaviors, diversifying your sourcing strategies, digitizing your customer buying experience, digitizing your supply chain to meet the speed imperatives, and building strong relationships through that innovative collaboration for all the links within your supply chain, I think these are going to be the key things for you to really be looking for. I think you're going to create a digital supply chain that unifies your market channels, provides transparency, creates collaboration, and ultimately empowers innovation. And of course, improves and creates a differentiated, consumer and customer experience. So those are my findings and looking at and look at everything that's moving in the market right now, and just kind of bringing that down and boiling it to a thesis of where people should be focusing and why supply chain is so important for you to turn your attention toward, at this point. And then more importantly, what are those key things that you should be looking for and striving for in the future? So I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope it was informative, and at a minimum, it was able to kind of get your thought process rolling, in this. And I'm happy to field any questions or take any additional conversations forward after this.
Great, thank you, Wendy. We did have some questions come up. I can buzz through them for a couple minutes and see what we have here. Let's see. So one says, Amazon earnings per share heavily affected on the expense side. That is why the EPS is not as well presented. And that is mainly because they are investing in face masks and temperature machines to ensure employee safety. The reason is not too much on the revenue side when discussing about EPS. Okay, so maybe more of a comment than a question. How does a middle market company manage inventory effectively if you're seeing more individual sales units by companies?
Yeah, so I think that really comes down to understanding what markets you're in, what you're selling to, if you're online, or if you have a specific strategy. A small to mid-size company really can't afford to bloat their supply chain with inventory to cover all the what ifs. So that kind of comes back to really making sure that your distribution network is well designed for the markets that you're intending to market in. People are reinventing their sales strategies, and when you reinvent those sales strategies, or you have those that you're putting on the ground and you're now looking to invest to expand those, it's really important that you also then look at your supply chain and where and to what amount, inventory should be placed in that supply chain. The biggest the biggest thing that I see people do is, whenever the supply chain is not agile and not diversified enough, that the solve for that is to flood it with inventory, right? Because the last thing that you can do is to have a dissatisfied customer base. And we've actually seen this with a few customers, because you're investing in the growth of the company, but if you don't meet that consumer demand, speed to market, timely, and as promised, then you can have the adverse effect where it actually starts to pull market share away, and your investment is literally you kind of watch it draining down the sink. So from an inventory from a perspective, you have to look at it first from a distribution footprint perspective, optimize that, and then you can overlay your inventory strategy on top of that. And again, forecasting, you can use forecasting based on historical trends, but I would highly encourage you to also scenario plan for the future inevitabilities, and make sure that you're infusing those elements into your strategy as well.
Yeah. How do you see ERP systems impacting middle market companies?
I have a technology background by nature, so I'm pretty passionate about this, and I've seen the rise of these ERP systems. In fact, I've even been a consumer of them in many cases in the past. What I'm seeing is a complete divergence in the market. With mobile applications, think about the fact that on your mobile phone, everything, you've got a little app for everything, right? Small to mid-sized companies are no longer, they have so many options now in the application marketplace that are readily available to them, that allow them to be more agile, allow them to be technologically advanced, rather than taking on the burden of a large ERP, which can be expensive, it can be heavy, it has to be highly configured and customized to meet your business model. And in my opinion, it's just not necessary anymore. There are lighter products out there that allow you to run your business and stand it up much quicker, much less expensively, and even maintain those as your business grows. An alternative to that I'm really seeing on the market is people really kind of focusing on the linkage platforms. So the ability, think about the ability to link together your weather app with your Uber app, with your shopping app, and create an experience that combines that information together through a linking platform, and you've got your own customized shopping experience for the day, right? And here's where Uber's running, here's where the sale is, and the weather's going to be raining or whatever. I mean, that's just an example, but that's in the retail market. But that also is becoming more and more prevalent in even business to business type markets as well. Being able to use those types of smaller applications to provide information into your business that help you make decisions based on earthquakes and hurricanes and things that are happening right now in the market. So I think that ERPs are great. They've been great. They've been big platforms. They have a lot of features and functions. They have a lot of purposeful value. I think they're hard to implement. They're expensive to implement, and I just think that there's so many more agile tech-based solutions today.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. So we're just at about an hour now. There are a few more questions in the chat. So as I said at the beginning, I'll compile those questions, and Wendy, I'll make sure that they get to you and your team with some contact information for follow-up. But thanks. This was really a terrific presentation, and I think quite a few actionable takeaways. As I said, for our viewers, if you'd like to connect with Wendy, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me, and I can connect you to the team at LynnCo. I want to thank again my colleagues at ACG New York who partnered with Los Angeles on today's session. And finally, before we leave, I'd like to remind everyone that our next session takes place this Thursday, May 7th at 4 p.m. Pacific. Dr. Joanne Wheathouse, who's the chairperson of the board and founder of MiraDX, will be presenting on the science of COVID-19, testing, operating and reopening businesses, and employee safety. Dr. Wheathouse is a professor and department chair at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. Her company, MiraDX, is producing roughly 10% of the COVID-19 tests that are currently being deployed in California. So certainly a timely expert on these issues. So please look in your email for the opportunity to register and register today if you will. With that, I'd like to say thank you again to Wendy Buxton from LynnCo Supply Chain Solutions, and to everyone else, a good evening. Good night.
Thank you.